Hey Pun, where have you been the last 2 months? Yeah, I'll admit this video took a lot longer than I thought it was going to, partly because my world corrupted and partly because I think I automated things I didn't have to. Regardless, Supersymmetry's MV age is quite possibly the greggiest thing I've ever done, hands down. Once I achieved MV, I decided to prioritize the construction of a greenhouse. This would be the cornerstone of my future power generation efforts. However, in order to get the greenhouse controller, I needed an NV assembler. That ended up being my first MV machine. The assembly machine in hand, the only other major ingredient to the greenhouse controller was sterling silver, which needed an MV mixer, of which I promptly crafted. However, when mixing up the silver, I realized I had a major problem. I couldn't just attach 4 LV steam turbines to an MV cable and expect it to work. I needed to transform the power up into MV power. However, I did not know this at the time and decided the best way to deal with the problem would be to build an MV battery buffer instead. While not the cheapest solution, it would work, the only major roadblock being actually making the batteries. Despite the energy issues, I did craft the greenhouse controller before going into the battery production line, just so I had it. Upon reaching MV, Sussy gives you 3 options for batteries: lithium, cadmium, and sodium. Lithium being the most expensive and sodium being the least. Now, thinking that the challenge of crafting the lithium batteries would be worth it, I decided to try and craft them. The first step was obtaining ethylene carbonate, as that would be a relatively large process that could help me progress in the pack in ways besides providing for the batteries. The first step in obtaining ethylene carbonate would be building a fermentation vat, as I needed a way of obtaining ethanol which would be later distilled into ethylene. Once constructed, I crafted and placed a few fixed bed reactors and the like to process the ethylene into ethylene carbonate. This is where things start to get sketchy. In order to actually obtain lithium batteries, I needed lithium and cobalt. However, what I didn't realize when I started crafting them was I didn't have high enough tier machines to process the lithium, and thus this entire endeavor was a waste of time. Shortly after realizing this, I set my sights on cadmium batteries, before again realizing I needed technology that was currently out of reach. So I begrudgingly settled on crafting sodium batteries, which admittingly was a lot easier than crafting the lithium batteries to start with. With the sodium batteries in hand, I reassembled my turbine in the center of my base and hooked everything up. I was finally capable of powering MV machines. Quick off-script interlude here. The reason why things seem so disjointed is probably because my base actually completely changed during this point because the world got corrupted. But yeah, back to the main video. Now back to the task at hand, the greenhouse. You see, this is all part of a bigger plan that involves the construction of a quadruple pyrolysis oven. You see, GregTech multi-blocks can share their walls, which allows you to cut some of the material costs of building 2 separate machines. I plan to use this to my advantage and build 4 wall-sharing pyrolysis ovens, which would be dedicated to processing wood from my greenhouse into sun gas as follows. The wood first enters oven number 1 and is decomposed into charcoal, which is sent to oven number 2 in order to become carbon, which is pumped to oven number 3 where it's turned into syngas. Now the 4th oven, that would decompose the leaves the greenhouse was producing into ash to be processed into carbon so I can make greenhouse gas renewable. While very expensive, this endeavor would prove to be very much worth it later on as it produced oodles of useful byproducts. I didn't utilize the quad oven completely at first though, as I had other priorities. I expanded the ethylene carbonate production line to store excess ethylene, and then built a small concrete plant as my next goal will be constructing the mining drill. This thing was huge and cost nearly 1,000 steel to build. Thankfully, I keep steel production running practically 24/7 so that wouldn't be a problem, and with the concrete plant build, I can construct the drill on top of an alluvial deposit. Now, why build this drill when GregTech veins are already so large? Platinum. I needed platinum. The only way I could get it currently is processing products that came from a large mining drill over an alluvial deposit. With the drill built, I constructed a small outpost outside that used solar boilers to provide it energy. Now I just needed a way of taking the alluvial deposit chunk things from the drill to my base. Supersymmetry comes packed with its own custom pack for immersive railroading, so I decided that setting up some sort of train system would be cool. I was wrong. So very wrong. I spent like 10 hours trying to get those chains to work to absolutely no avail. Instead, I decided that using GregTech's long distance pipes would be easier and cheaper. At the same time I was doing all this, I built a polymerization tank to make my ethylene into polyethylene, which is kind of a staple in GregTech at this point. With the deposit chunks coming directly into my base, they need to be processed into actual ores. The ore sorter will take the chunks and make them into different ores, with certain types of ores being more common than others. You can kind of view each chunk as a roll, with the result being an ore. The alluvial deposit chunks had 3 options when being sorted at MV power. Cassiterite ore, which was essentially tin, alluvial gold deposits, which I'm going to ignore, and alluvial platinum deposits, which are what we're looking for. Before the lengthy process of actually making the platinum deposits actual platinum, I decided to begin distilling some of the byproducts of the quad oven, as they would come in useful later as previously mentioned. Processing the alluvial platinum deposits wasn't really that expensive, just tedious, as it wasn't something I was planning to automate, and thus I was using the same machines for a lot of different things, and having to empty a bunch of acidic byproducts from their tanks was annoying. In fact, the most annoying part of the process was the sheer amount of acid required. Aqua Regia needed both hydrochloric and nitric acid, which were crafted from even more acids. After like a day's worth of acid production though, as well as the construction of a reaction furnace, I finally obtained some platinum dust, which I used to craft a platinum bed for a fixed bed reactor. I needed this platinum catalyst bed to produce acetaldehyde, the first step in what could possibly be the most complicated crafting process I've ever done. Now, this flowchart isn't completely updated to the version of the pack I played, but regardless, the Rubylith processing chain is massive, so I began preparations. First off, I built a second fermentation vat in order to produce biomass and methane. The biomass would go towards making more fertilizer for the greenhouse, and the methane would be used to make chloromethane, which is important later. Next, I built a gas turbine and hooked it up to my recently renovated quad oven setup. Now, I made a big mistake here. Wanting to reserve syngas, for some reason I opted to feed the gas turbine wood gas, which is significantly less efficient. And I also did this until I actually started drilling oil, which is way in the future. The last major prep stage before I began building all the Rubylith production chain was the production of superconducting cables. In GregTech, all cables lose power over distance, besides superconductors. Thus, with superconductors, it becomes way easier to centralize your power grid, which will be useful when I need dozens of machines in one room and I don't want to have like 8 power grids. The first step is making phosphorus, which involved a lot of animal fat for some reason. Next was manganese, which was easier. With the manganese and phosphorus obtained, I can mix them into manganese phosphide and shape them into wires. Now all that I needed to make them work was to cool them with liquid oxygen. I got that by compressing oxygen into hot, high-pressure oxygen, cooling it off some more, then decompressing it in a process that was less complicated than I thought it would be. With the superconductors in hand, it was time to conquer Rubylith. Remember the chloromethane? It was going to be mixed with the benzene I was getting as one of the byproducts of my quad oven into OP-xylene, which I would then turn into just P-xylene. This process is the major difference between my game and the flowchart, as their process for obtaining polyethylene terephthalate is quite different from mine. Anyway, with the xylene being produced, it was time to build the rest of the setup. Let me tell you, this thing was a beast, taking large amounts of methanol, oxygen, and xylene. It would run them all through 2 different reaction furnaces, a vacuum distiller, and then a polymerization tank, which would polymerize the terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol, one of the ethylene byproducts from earlier, into polyethylene terephthalate. This was just the beginning. Next up, we needed trimethylyl propane triacrylate, which I think may be the devil's personal messenger because I went through hell and back to get this stuff. But before that, I needed bromine for the acrylic catalyst that would allow me to make a major component of the TMPTA. Bromine is kind of a pain to get as it requires the construction of 2 gigantic evaporation beds and a brine pump, but they give me free salt, so I'm really not going to complain. After processing the brine into bromine and obtaining the acrylic catalyst, I set up my acetylene production. After combining that with formaldehyde from methanol, sodium hydroxide from an electrolyzer, and butyraldehyde, which comes from crotonaldehyde, which was from the acetylide, which, if you remember correctly, was the stuff I got the platinum in the first place, I finally got the TMPTA. Next up was the production of benzenediazonium chloride, which I highly doubt I pronounced correctly. This was more tedious than difficult to produce because like I already was producing all the constituents for my quad oven and I just needed to combine them. The last ingredient was gelatin, which was way easier than basically anything else. I just had to dissolve bone meal in acid and like purify it or something. Woohoo! Now we have Rubylith. Well, not really. We have acrylic photo emulsion. It needs to be combined with the red dye and polyethylene sheets to make Rubylith film, then layer with mylar, aka the polyethylene terephthalate, in an MV assembling machine. But once we got that, we got it. But what even is Rubylith? Rubylith is basically the brand name for a type of stencil thing used to draw stuff on circuit boards, and that's exactly what was going to happen, but not yet. After browsing through the sussy Discord, I decided my base wasn't exactly up to par, so I began renovating it. This probably took twice as long as making Rubylith did, and I'm not even sure why. While I was renovating, I decided it'd be best to fit the base with proper MV power grid, as I was currently just transforming LV power up. So I made MV superconductors, which were pretty cheap, and the only major challenge was liquid nitrogen, which had the same cooling process as oxygen. The only problem being I didn't actually have any nitrogen. This was resolved with a pressure swing absorber, a machine that descended from heaven itself. Not only did it produce nitrogen for free, but it also produced oxygen, something I was always running critically low on, and just like the superconductors were mine. The only major thing I did during the renovations was the construction of a second greenhouse, as my quad oven setup was running on a net negative of fertilizer, which could only be resolved by doubling my fertilizer consumption. Yeah, okay, that doesn't really make sense, but hear me out. The second greenhouse would be producing 4 times more material than the first greenhouse, as it would grow wheat instead of trees. This wheat would be loaded into my fertilizer chain instead of the relatively few saplings my tree greenhouse was producing prior. And by quadrupling the fertilizer produced, I would have more than enough to supply 2 greenhouses, so the doubling of the fertilizer consumption would be negated. Once the renovations were complete, it was back to my main goal, circuits. First off, I needed high purity silicon, which was very cheap. I also needed liquid silicon for the production of silicon butyls, which I automated quickly, with the only thing preventing me from producing more was the lack of silicon dioxide, but that wouldn't really become a problem. During this time, I built high purity water automation as well, which would be needed for cutting the silicon butyls. After using the high purity silicon in its liquid form to grow a silicon butyl from a crystal, I made some photoresist from leftover formaldehyde. This would allow me to image silicon wafers into viable circuits. I also needed to produce wafer treatment acid, which would be made using leftover hydrofluoric acid from aluminum production and hydrochloric acid, which I just had lying around. While these acids were mixing, my MV power grid suffered a catastrophic failure as I ran out of wood gas for my quad oven, which had become blocked up with creosote. In order to ensure nothing like this would ever happen again, I decided to pull an America instead of an oil pump in the desert. Then, to the enragement of millions of environmental activists, I built a several thousand block long pipeline, which is probably the least fun I've done in this pack. But, with the oil being pumped directly to my base, I constructed a quick and dirty processing setup that netted me kerosene, which was so much more efficient than wood gas it's kind of ridiculous to comprehend. After a few hundred hours, I finally ended my power crisis. With that done, I cut, imaged, etched, and polished up my silicon butyls into integrated circuits, which aren't really circuits in the GregTech sense, just key ingredients for them. Now, the only ingredient I was missing was electrum, so I made a quick little automation setup to produce silver and gold, then mix them together for electrum. With that, I made my first HV circuit. The last thing I needed for HV was stainless steel, but I decided to hold back on that and use the integrated circuits to make cheaper MV circuits beforehand. After I crafted my first batch, I made old picks, which allowed me to make MV energy hatches, with which I made a new blast furnace that was overclocked to HV. Then I made 2 arc furnaces. Stainless steel isn't expensive, and simply required me mixing some iron dust, some manganese, and some nickel in my newly crafted HV blast furnace to make carburized stainless steel, which would be combined with ferrosilicon, fluorite, quicklime, and ferrochromium to net liquid stainless steel. Once solidified, I immediately crafted a HV machine hull with it, and I ushered in HV. To be honest, I did not expect Sussy to have such a complicated MV age. This is still early game and we're making processing chains with over 20 steps. I really enjoyed this, but it was kind of a grind, especially the random platinum dust required as a catalyst for a setup to hide. I'll start work on HV soon, but considering how long MV took, it might be a while. Thanks for watching!